I'm Father James Connor. I'm originally from Tulsa, Oklahoma. I came from a family of 4 children, 2 sisters and 1 brother. And I came to the monastery when I was 16, right out of my junior year of high school. And at the time that I came, the community was flourishing. It was, at that time already, about almost 150 monks. At the time when I came, they still had a large tent out in the Preo garden. And it was actually used for a while there, but before they actually began building this building. But they left the tent up for quite some time, because at that time the men's retreat house was in what is now the south wing. And so the men would be on that side, would be looking out their window into the Preo and see this tent and get word that, the poor monks needed to build something, and consequently were in need of donations. so it stayed up for some time, even after they started building this building. The work that the novices did at that time, in the wintertime, was mostly cutting down wood trees in the woods and then splitting them up for logs. Our furnace was run by wood-burning furnace in the wintertime. And so we would cut them up in these great big 6-foot-long slabs, split them in at least quarter size, or sometimes more if the tree was bigger. And so that would be our main work in the summer. In the wintertime, the summertime, it was mostly in the garden. That whole area from this building all the way to the wall on both sides of the road was a very large garden, vegetable garden. And since at the time I was just 16 and not very sturdy or strong or heavy or anything like that, so the novice master took pity on me and made me an assistant to the electrician, who at that time was Father Mark, he wasn't a father, he was Father Mark. And so I worked with him for at least the last 6 months or more of my novitiate. Never really learned enough to call myself an electrician. I was mostly a gopher and would get the lights and get things that he was needed and have things lined up and hand them to him and like. But Father Mark was really a real nice fellow. He could speak to me since he was in charge of the work, but I couldn't speak to him. And that was pretty much the way it was in those days. Shortly after I made profession, or before I made profession, Merton was appointed to a new position, which they didn't have before, called Master of Students. And we had about 30 students who were preparing for the priesthood, doing studies. And so then in October, when I made my first vows and moved over to the professed side, then I came under him. And he was a real saving factor for me. He was very much someone who was open, attentive, at the same time had a great sense of humor. Was just very easy to deal with. We were also able, if we chose to choose him as our confessor as well as our master students, and so which I did. And so from 51 to 55, he was both my master of students and my confessor. And I've always considered that as being, a real time of grace for me. It was a time which certainly learned a great deal about monastic life during that time, because his conferences were very good. Was not always, his topics were not always strictly limited to monasticism. He would bring in all sorts of different topics. And I mentioned to him one of the first times that I went that I couldn't seem to pray with the way that the novice master instructed us. He would give out these little leaflets, which were polygraphed with a purple dye on them that they had in those days. And to give those out each evening. And it would be strictly the Jesuit mentality, and the Jesuit way of meditation, with a scripture passage and points of meditation derived from that. But I was never able to use, to successfully use that as real prayer. I could use it as sort of an intellectual exercise, but as far as really praying with it, I was never able to do so. And so one of the first times that I went to Merton, I told him about this, that it didn't feel like that I could really pray. And I thought at the time, I was almost afraid to mention it because I felt, well, he's liable to say, what'd you make vows for if you can't even pray? But instead he just looked at me and he said, well, it sounds like the Spirit is working. And that was such a freeing thing for me. It was just really, as if God himself looking down with benevolence and saying, yes, I do love you. And so that was a really liberating experience at the beginning there. And he was always that way when we'd go over to him for confession or for direction. He was very understanding. He was very compassionate, and didn't try to ram his ideas down our throats. He would present his ideas, but at the same time leaving it very free of whether we accepted him or not. We had one monk there, Father Gerald, at that time, who was very much a idiosyncratic monk, and or what we would call today as an individualist. And he was always bound and determined, that he had something the opposite to say of what Father Lewis was giving us. But Lewis was always very patient with that. Only one time that I saw him get a little bit riled by it, and letting Father Gerald know that he was going a little too far. So then I was ordained in 1957. And for me, that was really the fulfillment of a life stream. It had always been the thing that I wanted ever since I was a little kid, wanted to be a priest. It was what led me then to think about not only the priesthood, but what kind of priesthood. So then a friend of mine who was a year ahead of me in school, her uncle had made a retreat here, and she told me about it. And that seemed to sort of appeal to me. And so I read up on it in the Catholic Encyclopedia, and then finally read up on the book that Father Raymond wrote, The Man That Got Even With God, about Brother Joachim Hanley, who was a monk here in the 1800s. And all of that together just really appealed to me. So that was when I first wrote and came first for a retreat, and then the following year came and entered. One of the strange things which I've never been able to figure out myself is that I never experienced any homesickness when I came. And people who've talked about that sort of wondered in a sense, being just 16 and just still out of high school, and yet I don't know myself, I've never been able to figure that out. But in any case, I really felt at home here. I really felt that this was it. I can't say that I've ever had a real strong temptation to leave the monastery. But so in general, it was a young, lively group, and even though we couldn't talk with one another, we all learned the sign language very quickly and put it to good use. One of the constant proclamations in the chapter of fault in those days, was, "My brother makes too many sign languages," and or accusing yourself of making too many sign languages. And so it was not only the official sign language that we had, which would be in the books of the order, but then it'd be all the homemade make-up signs. The best example would be Brother Egbert at that time, who was later Brother Thomas, who died now. And the way that people would express his name was Egg Bird. So, it'd be a composite of putting word things together like that to get the words across. And of course, some of the old lay brothers were famous for the fact that they would not only initiate these signs, but they would also carry it out with whispering at the same time, so that you didn't hardly even need to watch them. They could almost just listen. Yeah, I was ordained on June 15th, 1957, and providentially, or whatever you're going to call it, it was not planned that way, but it was the day of my first Mass on June 16th was also my parents' wedding anniversary. And so it was, a real blessing for them. But my whole family was here, my parents and my brothers and sisters. Also my godmother, who had been, when I was baptized, and my uncle, who was my godfather when I was baptized. My family had sent money ahead to get a cake made, decorated for ordination. And we had a brother here who had been a professional baker before he came to the monastery. And he's the one who really began our fruitcake industry. I forget his name now. But he baked this lovely cake decorated with a chalice in the middle of it and everything. The priesthood for me has always been, throughout my whole life, the real raison d'etre. I've said before that, if we had the policy of those days, which we have now, that they won't assure you of the priesthood when you enter. I don't know whether I would have entered or not in those days, because it was something that meant that much to me. And it's always meant that much ever since, and all the different aspects of it. And I've had the opportunity of providentially of experiencing a lot of different aspects of the priesthood over the years. So anyhow, after I was ordained the following year, I was appointed as undermaster for Merton at that time was novice master. And so I worked with him for 3 years as undermaster. And that also was a real grace, because it was dealing with him on a whole different level than what it had been dealing with him as master of students and as confessor. But he was, very down to earth. One of the famous stories that I've told people about with him is when he was novice master and I was undermaster. We had at that time what we called summer postulants who would come and spend the summer here. And they were just young kids, very often still in high school or like. And but they would spend the 3 months of the summer with us and carry out the life pretty much. Anyhow, we had this one young kid who was obviously having a difficult time getting up for vigils. And so Merton began to suspect that something was up. So he told me to go up and check this kid's cell, the dormitory cell, while he was at work in the morning. And so I went up and checked it, and sure enough, underneath his pillow, or tucked by his mattress, there was a bottle of gin. And so I brought it down. It was probably 2/3 empty. And I brought it down and gave it to Father Lewis. And so, of course, that young man disappeared pretty shortly. But anyhow, about a week or so later, Father Lewis gave me a note at supper time. He said, after supper, come by my room. And so I didn't know what he wanted. So went by there. And he had his bottle of gin and some crackers. And so he and I finished off that bottle of gin after the kid had gone. It was good gin. Well, of course, I don't know gin that well, but it was good anyhow. But part of the fun was just sharing it with him, because he was so down to earth and so human and so real much of a father and a brother and everything. Several years later, when Merton went on his first trip, and before he went to Asia, though, he took a trip just to visit Christ in the Desert in New Mexico, and also our monastery of Redwoods, the nuns in California. And when he came back from that, he remarked to me at that time, he was very taken by Christ in the Desert. And he remarked to me at that time, "Oh, Tarcisius," he says, which is my name at that time. He said, "If you ever go any place, that's the place to go." And so in 72, Christ had been founded in 64. And by 72, it was almost on the verge of folding up. It was down to only 3 monks there. So they had written around first to a bunch of Benedictine monasteries asking for help to keep the place going. And because of the fact that their way of life was actually much closer to our way of life than it is to the Benedictines, they didn't get any takers. So then they started writing to our monasteries and asking. And Father Flavian, who was the abbot at that time, he knew of my interest in small communities. And so he asked me if I would be interested in going. I said, yes, by all means. And so that's how I happened to go there. The whole time that I was there, it was a powerful and a beautiful experience. I really look on that time as a real time of grace. The whole atmosphere of New Mexico, for one thing, but the area of Christ in the Desert in particular is just a gorgeous spot. The one who was prior, was diagnosed with cancer. And so that left me as the only priest there. And so I got made superior at that time. And so was there at Osage Monastery from, 78, I guess it was, until 90, about 12 years. And it was a good experience for me. There was 5 sisters that were there, and they had individual cabins, so it was really sort of almost an equivalent of sort of aeromedical life at the same time of community life. And they had retreatants that would come. They had cabins for them as well. And so getting into spiritual direction with them and the like at that time through that. So I had the exposure during that time for, not the whole time that I was there, but the first, I'd say the first 5 years that I was there, had the exposure of life as a pastor as well. And it was something that I enjoyed very much. I really found it very, very enjoyable, working with the people, working with the families. and loved it in many respects. I don't know whether I could really say that it tempted me to make that choice of staying with it or not. But anyhow, at the end of that time, what happened at the end of that time, I still to this day don't understand. Something happened in the relations between Pascaline and myself. And somehow or another it turned sour. And so it was very obvious that was not going to work out there. So I was very torn between whether I should come back here or whether I should talk with the bishop about establishing something similar to what Osage was doing there, for the diocese, or what. And so I asked Timothy if I could come back for a month, make a month's retreat back here. And so I came back in, I was right in 89, I guess it was, and made a private retreat on my own. At the end of that time, just came to the decision that the best thing definitely was simply coming back here to stay. So I came back then in January of 1990, and thought that was be the end of the road. But within 4 years, in 1994, I got asked to go to Ava. So I went down there in beginning of 94. Ava was very much of a mixed bag. It was, it had its pluses and it had its negatives. The community was not an easy community to deal with. So all in all, as time went on, it became pretty unsatisfactory. So then came back here in right in 99, and I've been back here since then. Strange as it might seem, I would have to say that the spirit of Gethsemani is in many ways the same as it has always been. Many things, of course, have obviously changed over the years in exteriors, between the changes of abbots and the changes of Vatican II and the changes in the order. But somehow or another, there's still a very, what I would have to say is a very unique spirit to Gethsemani, which I find, in visiting other houses. Certainly, Gethsemani is the only one that I would choose to live in, because it does have a very unique spirit of a spirit of prayer, a spirit of dedication, a spirit of charity, which I find, at least for me, to be, just the right balance, the right formula. I'm just very grateful to be a monk of Gethsemani and not some other monastery or someplace else. Particularly now, when every day when I walk through the cemetery, going on the way to church, just looking down, certainly every one of those graves in the lower cemetery and in the back cemetery, outside the wall, every single one of those I knew and lived with.